right, well, I think we can go ahead and get started, and then people can just trickle in. Before we kick it off to our presenters, we just wanted to take a moment and kind of pay some honor to Erik, and I think Loan had something that she wanted to talk about. For those of you who knew him or had memories or things you wanted to share, Loan, would you want to talk about that?
Yes, thank you, Clara. Hello, everybody. I've prepared a little text. Our colleague and friend Erik Herbert suddenly passed away last week, and we have been very shocked about this news, and we're still mourning our loss. Many of you knew Erik within NATURA. He was a leader of the Africa team of our Global Roadmap project, but this was only one of Erik's many endeavors. Erik is known worldwide for being the pillar of one of the most amazing projects that was led by an African city, the Freetown campaign in the capital of Sierra Leone. He built this project during his role as senior advisor to the mayor of Freetown, a project that has now been flourishing for 7 years. Erik knew so much, but he was also very eager to keep learning. He was writing the final parts of his master thesis at the University of Cape Town, and he was about to embark on a PhD journey at the Georgia State University in August. He was such an enthusiastic and passionate person. He was a true inspiration for us all, and we are so grateful to have had the chance to be part of his journey. Erik cared about building green and inclusive societies. We need to honor his vision and carry the work he started. In the meantime, for those of you who knew him and want to share a memory, we'll be holding some space for him for this. We have a memory wall where you're all welcome to share how you know him, how you met him, and how you remember him. Thank you.
And we'll be sharing this slide deck that you all can add memories, add pictures, and just celebrate all holidays mean to you and all the memories that you all have together. All right. Well, that being said, again, we want to show support to everyone. So if anyone needs space to talk or would like to just process that, please let the NATURA team know, and we'd be happy to talk with you all and just listen. But moving on to our presentations, we have two sets of presentations today. The first will be an update from the Urban Ecological Resilience Thematic Working Group with Dr. Timon McPhearson, Dr. Dave Kendal, and Dr. Erik Andersson. So I will hand it over to them to get into that update.
All right, thank you. And what topic could be better in these days than resilience? Although there's not one on political, psychological, legal resilience, the kind of resilience we perhaps particularly want in these days, but rather ecological resilience. So we'll report on the work we've done within the thematic working group on ecological resilience, but as importantly, on traits. So we've tried to look at resilience, see a traits lens, and also expand just how we think about functional traits, the life history characteristics that have been used to describe the ecological niche and functional role of different organisms, and how that could be better used, developed, expanded, and be better used to capture or speak to the human-nature relation, which of course will be part of ecological resilience unless we see ourselves as removed from the ecosystems we're part of. So this will try to cover to some level of detail at least. So on stage you will see Dave, still alive in Melbourne, still awake I should say. Timon, still alive in the US, which is no mean feat in these days, and me maybe alive we'll see about that, but nevertheless, here we go. So let's see if I can get this moving. So there are many more people than us, of course. So we'll try to represent the larger group, and I'm sure that I've missed names there too, and I see some of our group members in the room. So it has been a collective effort across a number of institutions, multiple projects and so forth, similar to most of the other Natura activities. What we've done, starting with the practical things, so some of our main efforts, we have had 2 conference sessions, starting with an early kick-off session, and this was almost back in the days when Natura was still under discussion. So this was one of the things that kind of developed together with Natura and fed into Natura as it started. So a session on traits as social ecological bridges at the IALE World Conference or Congress in 2019. We've also been present and had discussions at our 2 all-hands meetings, first Malta and then Miami. We had a longer in-person workshop in Stockholm in 2022, and we had another session on ecological resilience and traits at the Ecological Society of America conference in 2023. What we've tried to do is we've discussed and looked at the emerging research on urban ecological resilience. So not any kind of resilience, but we focused in on the ecological side of urban resilience. And also looking at response diversity as a way of understanding resilience and how response diversity is mediated by different types of traits that organisms and communities have. And the second part was to develop a traits-based conceptual framework for assessing urban ecological resilience and also people's relation to nature. And we've been working in parallel, half, and also in sequence, but at least had 3 main thrusts of our work. It's been the development of the conceptual framework, and it's not just conceptual, but also a computational framework on traits and ecological resilience. We've done a systematic literature review on how traits have been connected to ecological resilience in the literature. And we have developed a fledgling framework for traits as social ecological bridges, and this is the work that we've also then continued with and have an updated version of that framework or a slightly different framework as an outcome of the work we've done. So just if you're not too familiar with functional traits and the way they've been used in ecology, the functional traits are the characteristics that different organisms have that describe how they interact with their environment. So it tells you something about both how they react to and act on the environment that they are embedded in. So it's one of these interactive keys. So it is a way of understanding interactions. So there, of course, you can understand that it is a way of looking at how different organisms respond to things like climate change or land use change. It's also a way of asking questions about just what is the ecological basis for various different ecosystem services or nature's contribution to people. So it is a way of getting a functional read of the system and how it responds and changes as circumstances change. So this is the starting point, but it has also been a very ecological environmental way of looking at things. So we've tried to bring in more of a human perspective, and we also tried to use it to capture one of the many elusive things within our science, and this is just how to parameterize and how to measure, quantify resilience. And there I hand over to Timon to tell you a bit more about the resilience side of the work.
Thanks, Erik.
Timon, just tell me when you want me to move us to the next slide.
Great, will do. So as Erik said, this fundamental question that we're really trying to dive into in this working group is framed around ecological resilience, and you could frame it in a number of ways. This group is really focused in on the thinking of the relationship between biodiversity broadly, but even specifically species diversity, and how individual species and their traits may or may not confer resilience to the population, to the community, or to the ecosystem. And that really forced us to sort of back up and think conceptually about what do we mean by ecological resilience? How do we think about scale, for example, from individuals to populations to ecosystems? How do we think about it in spatial scales? So that's sort of ecological hierarchy in a way, but also how do we think about it in spatial scales? And so we, as Erik mentioned, we published a book chapter where we developed this conceptual framework. This was in the Nature-Based Solutions for Cities book, which is another product out of Natura. And on the right, you can see this kind of complicated diagram. But in essence, the overall idea here is that if we want to ask questions about ecological resilience, the framework suggests that we need to pick a starting point somewhere within the spatial scale, which is in the gray boxes, from the local to the city to the regional and farther up, as well as how we think about it for particular species that exist within functional groups that exist within communities, and recognizing that all of those interactions between species within their population, species and other populations, and how they interact within ecological communities and ecosystems are all part of understanding any particular response to a change in the environment that we know from ecological work over the last, I don't know, 150 years or more, that of course species are not sort of responding alone. They're responding in the mix of a community, both biotic and abiotic community. So the framework here is really trying to understand or rather suggest a way to start asking questions about, for example, how might we imagine particular species in an urban environment and whether they'll be resilient to various types of changes, for example, climate change, and whether changing weather conditions or climate conditions might impact a species. And to think about that means thinking about that in this context of a system, and to think about that in the context of working across multiple scales. So this framework was really helpful for us to start to think about different hypotheses that might be testable from a research perspective, various kinds of questions that we might be able to ask, and to allow us to start to guide the use of trait-based indicators to really look at this big question of urban ecological resilience in a larger context of urban resilience that I'm sure many of you are very familiar with. Next slide, please, Erik. So as Erik mentioned, there's some ongoing work led by some other members of the group who've been doing a literature review to really try to understand, so what is known? What does the literature already have to say about specifically the role of traits? And in this context, we've sort of recognized that there's a lot of work out there, but it varies across different types of taxa. So in the right, in this literature review approach, you can see that the green box in the lower left of the right panel, plants, you see a lot more papers that are focused on the role of traits in plants than there are in some other taxa. And so we really chose to focus the lit review on the role of and the understanding of what role traits play in thinking about urban ecological resilience, and specifically around plants. There's a lot of work, as you probably can imagine, in the broader literature on ecosystem services, but here the goal was really try to understand what has already been studied, said, understood when we start to think about the role of species traits and how they may confer or not confer resilience to a variety of different stressors. So some of the findings that we sort of highlighted here coming out of that, and again, this work is not published yet, but is in process, is, as I mentioned, most of these papers are focused on plants. There seems to be still limited research really bridging ecological resilience and ecosystem services, despite a lot of broader work on resilience, especially social, community resilience, et cetera, in ecosystem services. And non-terrestrial ecosystems and disturbances other than things like pollution and heat tend to be underrepresented. Next slide, please, Erik. So to get into some other layers of the work, so that's kind of the lit review background, which was a fundamental part of the work for this thematic working group, which is to say, what do we already know? Building on that, we're starting to ask these questions about how can we think further from the conceptual framework to even thinking about ways we might actually measure that. And so you can see some of the members of a working group here where we met in Stockholm to flesh out these ideas, to come up with some research questions and hypotheses. That book chapter mentioned came out of this, and this is ongoing work, which I'll show you a little bit more about in a moment. Next slide, please, Erik. Of course, the context, this probably doesn't need to be said, but depending on who we have in the audience today, it's probably useful just to say that this is in this broader context in Natura, where we've asked these sort of larger questions about the role and importance of nature-based solutions in cities to a whole variety of societal challenges. But what you can see here in the bottom is a sort of implicit suggestion that certain types of systems, of ecosystems, play particular roles in providing benefits to deal with certain types of challenges, whether that's green corridors that can, promote recreational activity, or riparian riverine areas that might provide spaces for blue infrastructure in cities that can provide a number of benefits, including cooling benefits, parks and trees and other things that can provide temperature regulation. So this is sort of the context that builds on the ecosystem services research that we're trying to ask the question, how do these ecosystems respond to change? How can they be resilient? And if they're not resilient, that's suggests a problem, because then we may not be able to have these benefits continuing to accrue over time. Next slide. So in essence, that's the gap. How do we ensure that the nature that we rely on for a variety of social, infrastructural, economic, and other benefits, how do we ensure that that nature that's the sort of core in some ways of nature-based solutions and the ecosystem functioning that it's providing can be resilient to the disturbances that it is facing? And that seems to be a question that has not been asked adequately within broader urban ecology and ecosystem services research. The second part of that is, okay, so even if we have some ideas about that, how can we evaluate it? So for example, if you are an urban forest manager and are trying to think about, say, trees that might need to be planted in some new forest areas or new park development, or even just replacing old trees that might have died, it's a natural question these days to ask what species are likely to be more resilient to various types of changes that will happen over the next many decades. Let's assume these trees are going to live for 50 years or more. So that kind of anticipatory question is a really important one to say, will these species be resilient and then provide the functioning that we want them to provide? And so a second part of our working group's sort of broad set of questions was really trying to understand, how can you even evaluate that? How can you even measure what it means for a species to be resilient or to some variety of challenges? So here we're looking at this, of course, in the urban context, and there's a variety of types of specific questions, and I'll kind of dive into that by digging into our conceptual framework a little bit further as a way of getting into the actual monitoring and evaluation component that we're just starting to get some work on, but maybe it'll suggest some ideas for others. Next slide. So what I didn't unpack a little bit more in our conceptual framework was not only sort of the spatial scales to consider and the ecological scales to consider, but another key portion of this was really answering fundamental questions about ecological resilience. So here this means we need to answer questions of resilience of what? Is it the species? Is it the functional group? Is it the community? Is it the ecosystem? Resilience to what? Is it a changing in precipitation conditions, increasing drought? Is it about pollution, other types of human impacts, changes in the built environment that might actually affect a particular species, or community? When are we asking questions about resilience currently, in the future, at what points in time, where, in terms of what are the places for this, and of course, resilience also for whom, which tends to focus on people in the broader context of urban resilience. But here we're also thinking about this similar in the context of what. So again, I've mentioned some of this in terms of thinking about how we might measure this at different ecosystem scales. But the suggestion here is that whatever we're measuring, it's going to be determined not only how an individual or population or community responds, but how they interact in that response to any particular type of disturbance. We've also reviewed a lot of the resilience literature in this process and tried to summarize this in what we call the 4 R's in terms of how we might think about what to measure. So can we measure the robustness of a population or a community? Can we measure their resistance, the ability for them to resist a particular disturbance? And what are the traits that might be associated with resistance and how that might differ, for example, from traits or responses that might confer an ability to recover from a disturbance, which if you think about that, I think even just the words themselves, you can see that there's potentially fundamental differences between what type of capacity, even if you think about this as yourself, as an individual, what type of capacity you might need to have to be able to resist change as opposed to recover from the impact of change or some disturbance. And then finally, also, when we think about broader concepts of resilience, it's not only resistance or recovery, but also being able to reorganize, sort of reestablish, make new connections as a way of being resilient to any particular disturbance. And so the 4 R's here are ones that we've used as a way to move beyond just a simple conceptual framing to start thinking about how we might measure this. And this is where we get back to traits, asking that fundamental question: what are the traits that species may or may not have that would confer robustness, resistance, recovery, and reorganization? The suggestion being that the more you have of the 4 R's, the more resilience you may have, which is a big assumption, actually. And there's a lot more to unpack there as well. Next slide, please. So just to give you a little bit more example of this is some previous work from the early parts of the working group. Some of this work was in the book chapter that we mentioned, which is free and available to download. So we can put that link in the chat for folks just to make sure everyone has access to that if you want to dig into this a little bit further. But here what we did is we looked at street trees in New York City. So you're seeing a map of New York City in all 4 panels here. And so our focus was on street trees. So here we have a functional group of trees, but we have a lot of different types of species. We looked at the most abundant tree species, the ones that exist most prominently all throughout the city. And we asked questions. So here we're trying to answer that question: resilience to what? And here we're in a multi-hazard context. So we're looking at resilience to heat, resilience to drought, resilience to storms. That's think about that as sort of high winds. And how we might put that together in the bottom right and add that up to look at what some larger aggregate of resilience might look like if you're trying to ask the question in a broader context like climate resilience. And there again, that can be very ambiguous. So here we broke it down into sort of 3 specific hazards. And in those were combined species information with trait information that would correspond to those 4 R's. The traits that we think from the literature, and again, there's a lot of literature review behind this as well, literature that would suggest that particular traits for particular species, for example, deep roots can, for some species, especially some of these abundant trees in the city, if they have deep roots, they're going to be more resistant to falling over during high winds in a storm. And ones that have shallow roots might be more susceptible to being blown over during a high wind storm event. So there, what we did, and this is the beginning of what we think could be some work to provide this kind of evaluation framework, is basically rank for any trait, for any species along those 4 R's, whether they have, for example, low, medium, or high resistance to wind throw. Wind throw being that trait that we're looking for that corresponds to things like deep roots that can resist wind throw or being thrown over by wind. So that's an example. We could go into this more, and if people have questions, I'm happy to talk a little bit more about a range of the traits that we looked at here, and again, dig deeper into the chapter if you want. And our goal here is to use that as a starting point, just to basically get us all going to start thinking about how can we measure ecological resilience, and not just for street trees, but for multiple taxa. And when we start to measure that, you realize the complexity of really trying to tackle this, and why we think there's quite a bit of both research and working with practice to try to understand really how can we ensure that urban ecosystems can be resilient, and what might we need to do, whether it's new planting palettes or management practices or even other types of behavior change, so that we can support ecosystems to be resilient in the ways that we want them to be, so that we can rely on them for ecosystem services now and in the future. Next slide. I think I might be nearing the end. Yeah, so there's obviously some limitations, as I mentioned. We're just starting to unpack this because there's so much to dig into when you start to explore this, especially with a particular case, as I was showing you with the urban trees. So one is trait data isn't available for all of the 4 Rs for all species that you might be interested in looking at. So this is just a fundamental challenge of really trying to even answer questions about ecological resilience. Is some of the data that we need to evaluate it just doesn't exist. It hasn't been gathered. And certainly if it has been gathered, it may be hard to find or get access to. So the lack of adequate trait data is a persistent challenge, but it shouldn't, I guess our group has been suggesting it shouldn't stop us from getting started on this work. And that if we can do that, we can even expose more the need to gather trait data, really understand some of these questions. Another limitation is that traits may be expressed differently. So just because a species has a trait doesn't necessarily mean that that trait will be expressed in a way we might want to assume. Again, going back to the framework, because the expression of a trait may not only differ in different contexts, in different, say, climatological context or other types of urban contexts, but it may also differ because of the actual ecological community that species exists in that may influence the expression of a trait. So there's a lot to really unpack around how traits may or may not be expressed. Another is when we think about measuring this, we're really not measuring resilience, we're really measuring potential resilience, right? If we're looking at a whole range of traits and how they might confer this particular capacity or that capacity, for example, along the 4 Rs, we're still making some assumptions that if they have that trait will be expressed and that trait will confer, for example, robustness or resistance. It's sort of a classic problem in resilience that you're often asking questions about what might happen under a certain condition. So basically scenarios, rather than evaluating after the fact, after a disturbance. And so this really calls on, I think, the whole field to start thinking about how we might set up experiments and other ways of really looking at actual events after they happen and evaluating those, which has been done for other types of questions in ecology for a very long time. So this suggests, as at the bottom, as you can see, need for data collection, for new field studies, for thinking about how we might use IoT sensors and other types of remotely based sources to gather trait information, but also responses as disturbances arise. And finally, to really start thinking about how we can account for trade-offs between resilience and other types of functioning that may be important for those species as well. The bottom right really, though, is to say that we do think that the conceptual framework, the ways we've tried to start working this out with some particular case studies, is a generalizable approach. It's something that can be applied to other taxa. And especially where trait data are available, we would really welcome not only collaboration, but people just to pick this up and run with it and to test this out in their own studies, in their own sets of research questions that they might have. Next slide. Erik, am I passing to you, or I can?
We can skip that one. We'll get back to some of the, well, still unfinished or inconclusive things. So thank you, Timon. Let's move on. So if you remember, that was the second track on just how we think about traits. So of course, there are all the details that comes with the resilience assessment of trying to figure out just when and in what ways traits may confer resilience. But we were also interested in the broader questions of, could traits be used to add another way of working with, another set of handles to the now increasingly popular relational approach to looking at nature and looking at us in nature and how we relate to it? Traits is the way of, so we too have traits, of course. We are ecological entities as well as all other organisms. So this is the way of understanding some of the basic ways that we interact with the environment, as I said. So what we're trying to develop, and here too we're focusing on, as we identified in the literature review, we know most about plants, so that was where we started. We've worked primarily with plants, but of course this has bearing also on other organisms. But what we've been trying to do is to develop a plant trait framework that better captures human-other relations, or human-plant in this case. What we've done, we've published a journal article, What are the traits of a social ecological system, towards the traits framework in support of urban sustainability. And we have a second paper in progress. And the idea has been to really try to position traits and a continued investment in better understanding, and also maybe identifying new traits as a central theme for connecting ecology more solidly to more socially flavored ways of understanding our existence. So starting, and this will be a bit of a time journey, so starting with entry point, we created a framework based on that conference session we had at the Yale World Congress. Positioning traits as first, that we need to pay attention both to the effect and the response side of traits, as it's been named in the literature, to understand both what they do and what an organism does in a system or in a local environment, what kind of influence it has on others, on the general environment, and also, of course, how they respond to especially changes in that same environment. So that was the first, pointing both to the functionality and to the, if you will, resilience side of traits. The second, and this is the main suggestion here, is that we claimed that traits could be used as a boundary object, something that connects different disciplines, different perspectives, try to bring together different languages, different ways of understanding people and people's relation to nature and position in nature. And these two considerations then we suggested could feed into decision making, that this could provide information for the decisions we need to make on how to make systems more resilient, and also to make sure that we can safeguard the very many different functions that we rely on and expect from anything from local nature to the earth as a whole. So that's where we started, and then Dave can tell you a bit more of what we've done since and how these thoughts have evolved. So please, Dave.
Thanks, Erik. And I'm feeling a bit guilty with saying that we started doing all this in 2019, and a few things have been getting in the way, of course, but we're getting closer to getting this published. I think it's been rejected a couple of times, so we've got some insight into what we need to do to get it published, which is good. So yeah, this is stuff I think that we've been working on these ideas, going back, so Erik and I in various projects, going back sort of 10 or more years, I think, and it's nice to be continuing to work on it. So if we go to the next slide, I think so with the traits work, I work a lot with ecologists, like sort of very pure ecologists who don't necessarily have a huge interest in sort of social sort of theories or social research, even if they're interested a bit in people. And the idea, I think, is that we know that humans are really influencing systems and really part of the system. So if we think about traits and the role that they have in ecological terms, so that the functions they provide, the way they shape the distribution and abundance of plants, that humans are really part of that. There's a lot of literature in urban ecology that talks about humans as kind of a black box, acting in the same way as an environmental filter. So the way the drought or temperature change might act as a filter on the plants or the traits of the plants that exist in a community. Humans have been sort of given the same role. So they act as a filter and filter out things that they don't like. So that people talk about preferences as being part of the filter. And so one of the things we're trying to do is take that role of humans a little bit more seriously. So rather than using the metaphor of a filter, we're using another ecological concept, which is ecosystem engineers or niche constructors, where the humans actually actively create environments that are more suitable for plants with traits that they prefer. So rather than this sort of I guess the mechanisms that how the filtering work isn't really interrogated, whereas the niche construction or ecosystem engineer gives you more ideas on the behaviors or the practices or the actions that humans take to do that. And the other part of that too is, yeah, it's nice working in this group where everyone takes humans very seriously. And so we understand that there's a big range of social theories and disciplinary perspectives that can help understand why humans do what they do. So we can think about cultural theories or individual psychological theories about the way people interact with their environment, or political drivers about justice. So then we can start to understand both the actions that humans are taking and meaningfully what the drivers of those actions are, sort of drawing on social science and humanities. So yeah, and I think the idea is if we can do this better, we can actually make much better predictions about what the future trait profiles of, particularly urban ecosystems are going to be. Okay, so if we go to the next slide. Yeah, so maybe I'm in Australia for those who don't know me. So I'm just out of Melbourne now, but still in grassland country. And yeah, any example I guess that's important to me is thinking about we did some work in ecology looking at traits across an urban-rural gradient that showed that there was a decline in fire frequency in urban areas and a subsequent increase in plant height and a few other trait changes as well. But height was the main one. So that's a very sort of ecological way of thinking about what's going on. But yeah, I've been lucky to work with a lot of traditional owners here, and there's some other bodies of research that really see grasslands as cultural landscapes. So they're not the outcome of natural ecological processes where humans aren't involved. They're the outcome of high frequency fire. So the same in systems in the US and other places, I'm sure. So without humans, we wouldn't have had these grasslands that have been regularly burnt for tens of thousands of years, fire stick farming. And more recently, one of the reasons, so the fire's been suppressed across a lot of the Victoria, or a lot of Australian landscapes, and apart from the giant wildfire outbreaks that we're seeing in Australia and around the world, but these regular, frequent fires have been suppressed. But one way that they continued in rural Victoria, so the reason that there's this change in plant height is because volunteer rural fire brigades do a lot of training and they do preventative burns along roadsides so that they create fire breaks that are wider than roads. And they do that every few years, and that sort of is mimicking the cultural practices of traditional owners. So actually now so sometimes that doesn't happen anymore, and so for fire breaks they'll grade roadsides instead of burning them. So yeah, it's this sort of cultural sort of tradition of rural fire brigades burning roadsides that's led to the persistence of grasslands in rural areas and native grasslands, and the change in traits. So for us to understand and predict future, the traits of landscapes into the future, we need to understand these ecological things about how plants respond to the environment and plant height and other things like that. But we also need to understand cultural practices. So the traditional owner, burning is being reintroduced in a lot of landscapes across southeastern Australia. And there's a lot of political kind of contest around volunteer fire brigades. So, there's a whole lot of sort of social questions about that too. But knowing this, we can kind of work with traditional owner groups. We can work with volunteer fire brigades, and think about how we bring these practices back into urban areas. And if we can do that, we'll sort of see that increase in plant height actually might be reversed because of the cultural sort of behaviours of different people in the cities. So for me, these stories just make it really obvious that the ecological trait story is real and important, but it exists within this social ecological context and cultural context, and we need to understand that if we're going to make meaningful predictions about the future. Okay, so next slide. Sorry, it is pretty late here, so I hope this is making sense. So yeah, we probably covered this enough. So traits have a sort of specific meaning in ecology, but it's a vernacular word. So I think that it's okay to think about characteristics of plants that are not necessarily traditionally considered ecological traits. So another thing that's shaped me is I'm colorblind, and so I've done a bit of work on plant color. So plant color is not normally considered an important ecological trait, but it is an important trait of horticultural plants and traits in urban areas. And so again, just another way of thinking about that. Maybe let's go to the next slide. Yeah, and again, I think we've kind of covered this a little bit. So I think that, especially in urban areas, we know the role that humans play in shaping trait profiles is really important. So these landscapes that we see, whether they're in Australia, there's still quite a lot of remnant ecosystems that occur in urban areas. So I think a lot of people think that they're the natural sort of outcome of, or at the outcome of natural processes, ecological processes. But in reality, most of these are cultural landscapes and have been shaped for tens of thousands of years. And certainly there's been a lot of work in the US looking at that, and most other Africa and South America and Asia too. We're mostly talking about cultural landscapes. So where there's obviously ecological processes that shape what occurs, but within these sort of much more cultural context. Next slide. Yeah, so maybe I think this is probably where I'm going to stop talking. So if we go back to those original plant effect response trait frameworks, we think we can, we're kind of really trying to speak to ecologists here, trying to get people to take the human seriously, so we can use an ecological framework, which is kind of the black part of this diagram, and add feedback, add humans into that and their role in niche construction, shaping environments to achieve desired traits, perceiving particular kinds of traits, and obviously understanding ecosystem supply and demand too. So there's sort of multiple feedback loops. And within the human box, it's not just a black box that we use, as a metaphor for ecological processes. We can use, social and ecological theories and methods to understand drivers of behaviour and, potentially make predictions about the future. All right, I hope that made sense. So.
Right, thank you, Dave. And now just quickly to wrap up, we have or had, before various other things happened, future plans. So this is what we've been doing over the last few years. And of course, we hope to somehow be able to continue the work to conclude some of the things we've started, the lit review, the ecological resilience, computations and estimates, and also that at least get that extended framework, expanded framework published. So what we're looking at now are just ways of making sure that we can complete our manuscripts. Basically, and now increasingly important and difficult in our current times is to explore options for future funding to make sure that we can continue the work of sorts. Much of this has been on a slow burn before, sometimes during Natura, but Natura has helped it move forward. And now at the end of Natura as we know it, knew it, we need to find other ways of moving forward with this if we want to continue to dig into this. As you have heard, we've asked more questions than we've necessarily come up with answers. So there's plenty more of work to be done, but then we need to have some solid support for it. Otherwise, it'll be like Dave's and my pet projects, which have been developing over 10, 15 years, very, very slowly. They happen too, but again, not very quickly.
Yeah, I can see that Timon posted some links to Philippa Grillo's papers too. And so Philippa's been sort of co-leading this stream of work that we've just been talking about too. So we should definitely acknowledge that. But also NATURA has brought us all together. So I remember having some really great conversations with Philippa in Miami last year. And yeah, the function of NATURA as a network bringing people together has been really important. And yeah, I know it's difficult it is difficult to get funding for things like that, but in my mind, it's been a really powerful and useful way to connect. So.
You know, and much of it has developed in parallel because we have had funding in different places. As they just said, this was the original idea with NATURA, that you just add a bit of extra to work that is already going, ongoing. So that has been the way we've worked, and now we'll just need to think about how to move forward. If you want to get in contact and know more about what we've done and also thoughts about the future, I only listed, I could have added Philippa and Dave, but Timon and I have been the formally responsible people for the thematic working group, so I only added our email addresses. But please, if you are interested in traits, I'm sure that and ecological resilience will definitely move forward somehow. We just don't know exactly how yet. So whether it's the thematic working group staying together or there's some other legacy of the NATURA or just get in contact with either one of us, we'll see what comes next.
Wonderful. And I know we initially planned for time for questions, but we do have Dr. Bing, who will also be